What most people get wrong about an empath is that their collapse never arrives without warning. It isn't a dramatic outburst or a single moment of surrender. It's a gradual, nearly invisible buildup, layer upon layer, moment upon moment, where emotional weight accumulates quietly beneath the surface. An empath doesn't respond the way most people anticipate. When they're wounded, they don't strike back immediately. They reflect, they rationalize, they seek to understand. If someone disrespects them, they don't rush to judgment. They search for context. Maybe that person is struggling with something. If someone pulls away or turns cold, the empath doesn't mirror that behavior. They move closer. Maybe that person needs more support. This is where the cycle begins, because what appears as patience from the outside is often an internal battle. The empath is constantly weighing what they feel against what they believe others deserve. They suppress their own emotional instincts in order to protect the relationship, and over time, this creates a destructive pattern. They start accepting what should have been unacceptable from the very beginning. Every time a boundary is crossed and left unenforced, something subtle shifts, not on the surface, but within. The empath registers it. They feel it profoundly, but instead of addressing it, they file it away. They tell themselves it isn't worth the disruption. They persuade themselves that understanding matters more than reaction, so they absorb it. This is the part most people never witness, because the empath doesn't always display pain in visible ways. They don't announce every disappointment. They don't list every betrayal aloud. But psychologically, nothing is forgotten. Everything is recorded. Every inconsistency, every moment of being underappreciated, every instance where their effort went unmatched. And here's where it becomes essential to distinguish between endurance and tolerance. Endurance is deliberate. It has boundaries. Tolerance, when stretched too far, becomes self-betrayal. The empath, without even realizing it, begins crossing that threshold. They are no longer choosing to stay. They feel compelled to stay. Not because the situation warrants it, but because they've poured too much of themselves in to simply leave. So they give more. They communicate more openly. They grow more patient. They attempt to repair what was never theirs to fix. And in doing so, they unknowingly send a very clear message to others that there are no real consequences for how they treat an empath, that their forgiveness is a given, that their presence is permanent. This is how the imbalance takes root. Because while the empath is pouring in more effort, the other person often pulls back, not always out of cruelty, but out of conditioning. Human behavior follows patterns of reinforcement. When there is no pushback, no boundary, no consequence, behavior doesn't self-correct. It intensifies or grows careless. And still, the empath remains. Not out of weakness, but because they are built for depth. They don't connect superficially. They don't invest lightly. When they choose someone, they commit, emotionally, psychologically, and often morally. Leaving doesn't feel like a simple choice. It feels like abandoning something sacred. But here's the paradox. The more they silence their inner signals, the louder those signals grow. What was once a quiet discomfort becomes emotional exhaustion. What was once patience becomes depletion. And what was once hope slowly transforms into something far more powerful, clarity. Because eventually, the empath reaches a point where the pattern can no longer be denied. Not through one incident, but through repetition. They begin to recognize that it wasn't just a rough patch, a misunderstanding, or a temporary season. It was a consistent dynamic, and once that recognition takes hold, everything they've been holding doesn't evaporate. It organizes, it aligns, it suddenly makes complete sense. This is why their breaking point appears so sudden to everyone else. Because while others were only focused on the current moment, the empath had been carrying the full weight of history. So when they finally step back, when they go silent, when they stop explaining, it isn't an overreaction. It is the conclusion of a process that has been quietly unfolding for a very long time. And by the time others notice the shift, the internal decision has already been made. Because an empath doesn't break when they're hurt. They break when they finally accept that the hurt was never going to end. And once that truth settles in, there is no returning to who they once were. There is a moment in the empath's journey that changes everything, but it rarely appears dramatic from the outside. It arrives without announcement and often without conflict. It happens in silence, on an ordinary day, in an ordinary interaction, when something internal finally clicks in a way that cannot be undone. It isn't that the empath suddenly becomes a different person. It's that they finally stop misreading what has been happening all along. Up until this point, the empath has been operating under a quiet internal belief that people are fundamentally good, that effort will eventually be returned, and that with enough clarity and communication, things will improve. This belief system is powerful because it's rooted in who they are. They don't want to view people as disposable. They don't want to reduce connection to an exchange. So they assign meaning to behavior that objectively doesn't deserve it. They interpret inconsistency as complexity. They label emotional neglect as stress. They frame distance as temporary. And in doing so, they postpone a truth their nervous system has already been registering for a very long time. But the human mind has a threshold for contradiction. You can only hold conflicting realities for so long before something must resolve. For the empath, that resolution doesn't arrive through conflict, it comes through perception. There is a shift where they stop asking, "Why is this happening?" and begin asking, "Why am I still justifying this to myself?" That question is the beginning of awakening, because once an empath starts observing without excusing, the emotional haze begins to lift. Patterns that were once softened by emotion become structurally clear. The inconsistency is no longer random, it's consistent. The imbalance in effort is no longer accidental, it's repeated. The emotional confusion they once felt starts to look less like complexity and more like a pattern. And this is where the internal fracture occurs, not between them and others, but between their perception and reality. They begin to see that they weren't simply participating in a relationship. They were managing it, holding it together, compensating for gaps they didn't create, filling emotional spaces that someone else refused to occupy. And the most uncomfortable realization isn't that they were hurt, it's that they were needed far more than they were valued. This is the moment clarity begins to form. But clarity is not immediately liberating. It doesn't feel like strength at first. It feels disorienting, because clarity removes the emotional justification that made endurance possible. It strips away the stories that kept them loyal. It dismantles the internal narrative that whispered, "This will improve if I just try harder." And without those stories, the empath is left with something raw, truth without emotional cushioning. That's why this awakening often registers as emotional distance before it feels like strength. They retreat inward long before they retreat externally. Conversations that once felt meaningful start to feel repetitive. Effort that once felt purposeful starts to feel one-sided, and most significantly, the emotional urgency they once carried begins to fade. But what's truly occurring is not disconnection from others. It is reconnection with self. For the first time, they are no longer reacting to what could be. They are responding to what is. And reality carries a very different emotional weight. There is also a quiet but significant psychological shift that occurs here. The empath stops seeking understanding from people who have repeatedly shown they are unwilling to offer it. This is not bitterness. It is efficiency. Emotional energy is no longer spent on explanations that lead nowhere. The need to be validated by the very source that caused confusion begins to dissolve. This is where the empath becomes psychologically formidable, not to others, but to old dynamics. Because once someone stops over-explaining, over-giving, and constantly adjusting, the entire structure of the relationship shifts. The imbalance loses its foundation, the system loses its balancing mechanism. And that is when people feel the change. They don't always understand it, they simply sense it. The empath is still physically present, but emotionally something has withdrawn. The urgency is absent. The availability is no longer reflexive. The emotional accessibility that was once assumed is now earned. But what others experience as distance, the empath experiences as alignment. Because for the first time, they are not reacting from fear of losing someone. They are responding from recognition of truth. And once that recognition becomes irreversible, the empath no longer argues. They no longer attempt to persuade. They no longer try to rebuild what was never constructed equally. They simply see it clearly, and in that seeing, the illusion dissolves. Because the awakening of an empath is not the moment they stop caring. It is the moment they finally understand what they were carrying all along and choose to set it down for good. And once that realization becomes permanent, the former version of themselves never returns. When an empath finally detaches, most people misread it entirely. They assume something has broken down. They believe the empath has become cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable in a damaging way. But what is actually taking place is far more precise than that. It isn't emotional shutdown, it's emotional reorganization. For a long time, the empath functions in a state of heightened emotional engagement. They are tuned in, responsive, and acutely aware of subtle shifts in tone, behavior, and energy. They don't merely hear what people say, they interpret what lies beneath it. That level of perception creates depth and intimacy, but it also creates vulnerability in environments where that depth is not returned. Because when you are consistently emotionally open in a one-sided dynamic, something begins to happen internally. Your system starts compensating. You begin filling gaps in communication. You begin anticipating needs that are never expressed. You begin sustaining emotional continuity for both people in the dynamic. And over time, that becomes exhausting in a way that isn't visible from the outside. What looks like care is actually sustained cognitive and emotional labor. So when the empath reaches their threshold, the shift is not explosive. It is not reactive. It is not emotional chaos. It is the opposite. It is silence, but not hollow silence, structured silence, conscious silence, the kind that comes from a mind that has already processed far more than it is willing to continue expressing. And this is where people grow confused, because they were accustomed to a version of the empath who explains, who clarifies, who smooths over tension, who works to repair misunderstandings before they spiral. That version of the empath is relationally active. But once detachment begins, that entire behavioral system goes quiet. Not because the empath has lost their capacity for empathy, but because empathy is no longer being offered without condition. This distinction is critical. Emotional detachment in an empath is not the absence of feeling. It is the removal of automatic emotional access. It is the transition from open emotional processing to structured evaluation. In simpler terms, they stop reacting in real time to emotional stimuli that once pulled them into over-involvement. And when that happens, something very noticeable emerges: stillness. But it isn't the stillness of peace. It is the stillness of clarity. They are no longer internally negotiating every interaction. They are no longer converting confusion into patience. They are no longer absorbing emotional inconsistency and trying to stabilize it from within. That labor ceases. And when that internal labor stops, their outward presence transforms dramatically. They become more deliberate with language. They no longer rush to fill silence. They no longer over-explain their limits. They no longer feel pulled to rescue conversations from discomfort. And to those who depended on their constant emotional engagement, this feels like loss. But from the empath's perspective, it is restoration, because for the first time, their emotional energy is no longer being spent in real time managing other people's internal states. It is being redirected inward, into observation, into evaluation, into self-regulation free from external interference. And here is what most people miss. Detachment is not withdrawal from connection. It is withdrawal from imbalance. An empath does not stop caring. They stop compensating for emotional irresponsibility in others. They stop converting inconsistency into potential. They stop confusing intensity with genuine intimacy. And once that stops, relationships that relied on emotional overperformance begin to destabilize. That destabilization is what others experience as distance. But in reality, nothing has been removed that shouldn't have been examined long ago. What has changed is that the empath is no longer filling emotional voids that were never theirs to fill. This is where emotional power begins to emerge, not in dominance, not in control, but in restraint. Because restraint is what most people cannot sustain when emotionally triggered. They react, they chase, they explain, they attempt to mend. The empath, in contrast, learns to observe without immediate response. And that pause, that space between stimulus and reaction, is where power develops. In that space, they reclaim choice. Choice over engagement, over explanation, over emotional investment, and above all, over access. This is why detached empaths are so often misunderstood. People assume they have become indifferent, but indifference requires no awareness. What the empath has developed is awareness without compulsion. They still perceive everything, they still understand everything, but they no longer feel obligated to act on everything. And that shift transforms the entire psychological dynamic, because emotional access is no longer guaranteed. It must be earned through consistency, respect, and reciprocity, and anything less simply doesn't register as worthy of emotional investment. So what reads as emotional distance is actually emotional precision. And once an empath reaches this place, they are no longer driven by the fear of losing people. They are guided by the awareness of what it costs to keep them. And in that realization, silence is no longer a reaction, it becomes a decision. A decision that quietly dissolves every dynamic built on emotional imbalance, without a single argument ever needing to take place. What follows emotional detachment is often mistaken for the conclusion of the empath's story, but in reality, it is the beginning of something far more grounded and intentional. Because once an empath has seen through patterns, stepped back from imbalance, and stopped overextending their emotional reserves, something significant begins to surface beneath all that experience. Structure, not emotional reactivity, not survival-based connection, structure. And that structure is what we call boundaries, but not in the way most people envision them. Most people draw boundaries in moments of frustration. The empath learns something different. They discover that boundaries are not reactions to harm. They are prevention systems, designed to eliminate the repetition of harm before it begins. This represents a fundamental psychological shift. Prior to this stage, the empath operates in a relational model built on adaptability. They adjust, accommodate, interpret, soften, and continuously recalibrate themselves to maintain connection. But after enough cycles of emotional imbalance, something inside them stops negotiating and begins filtering. And filtering is fundamentally different from accommodating. Filtering means the empath is no longer asking, "How do I make this work?" They are asking, "Does this deserve access to me at all?" That question alone transforms everything, because now every interaction is no longer emotionally immersive by default. It is evaluated, not through judgment, but through recognition. The empath begins identifying patterns far earlier. Inconsistency is no longer something they attempt to resolve. It is something they detect quickly and step back from before emotional investment takes root. This is where self-respect transitions from concept to conduct. And conduct is what defines transformation, not intention. They no longer suppress discomfort simply to preserve connection. They no longer put their own needs on hold, hoping others will eventually notice. They no longer remain in environments where clarity has to be constantly demanded rather than naturally offered. What matters here is that this is not emotional withdrawal, it is emotional refinement. Because the empath doesn't lose their capacity for connection. They simply become more precise about where that capacity is directed. Their time is no longer freely extended to confusion. Their attention is no longer automatically granted to inconsistency. Their emotional presence is no longer a default setting. It becomes conditional, not transactionally, but respectfully. And something interesting begins to occur socially. People who relied on the empath's overperformance begin to notice an absence where presence once lived. But what they interpret as rejection is actually the removal of compensation. The empath is no longer balancing inequity in relationships that were never mutual to begin with. This is why the shift feels so significant, because the empath is no longer engaging in dynamics that depended on their emotional surplus. And in that absence, the true nature of the relationship becomes visible. But internally, something even more meaningful is unfolding. The empath is no longer building their identity around how much they can endure. They are no longer measuring their worth by how much they can tolerate. They are no longer confusing emotional sacrifice with emotional value. Instead, they begin anchoring their sense of self in something more stable. Choice. Choice over who they engage with. Choice over what they allow. Choice over where they invest emotional energy. And once choice becomes the foundation, emotional chaos loses its grip. Because chaos only controls systems without structure. When structure is introduced, chaos becomes irrelevant, and that is what boundaries ultimately create. Not distance from people, but protection of internal order. The empath is no longer emotionally accessible to dynamics that disrupt that order. And that is not punishment, it is preservation. This is where emotional intelligence matures into emotional authority, not authority over others, but authority over self. They no longer need to state their boundaries loudly because their behavior already reflects them. They no longer need to repeat their limits because those limits are already visible in the choices they make. They no longer need external validation for their decisions because those decisions are now internally aligned. And that alignment produces something rare: emotional consistency. No more internal conflict between what they feel and what they accept. No more gap between their intuition and their actions. No more self-abandonment in the name of connection. And from the outside, this looks like transformation, but from within, it feels like return. A return to a self that was never fully protected before. So when people claim they broke the empath, what they failed to grasp is that breaking was never the final destination. It was the turning point. What emerged afterward was not damage. It was definition. A clearer understanding of who they are, what they will permit, and what they will never allow again. And once that clarity is fully established, the empath doesn't return to the version of themselves that mistook endurance for love, because they've learned something that cannot be unlearned. Not everyone deserves access to your depth. And once that truth becomes lived experience, the way they move through the world is permanently altered. Not louder, not colder, but unmistakably wiser.